Ukraine bravely defends itself, but it is not winning the war, and without Western support, it would be doomed to failure. According to the American magazine Time, it is becoming increasingly difficult to convince Ukraine's Western partners that victory in the war with Russia is just around the corner. After his September visit to Washington, President Zelensky stated that "No one believes in our victory as much as I do. No one." He also admitted that engaging in convincing allies of the possibility of Kyiv's victory through their help consumes all forces, all energy. After 20 months of full-scale war, about 20% of Ukrainian territory remains under Russian occupation, resulting in the death of 10,000 civilians and soldiers, Time magazine points out. President Zelensky notes during his foreign visits that global interest in the conflict in Ukraine is waning. Additionally, support from the international community is decreasing, the newspaper points out. Most worryingly, part of the world seems to be getting used to the war in Ukraine, the president declared. As the magazine emphasizes, public support for Ukraine in the USA has been declining for many months, and Zelensky's visit to Washington did not change this trend. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is progressing slowly and involves huge losses, which makes it increasingly difficult for Zelensky to convince partners of an impending victory. Additionally, in the face of the outbreak of conflict in Israel, keeping the world's attention on the situation in Ukraine poses a significant challenge. One of Zelensky's associates, asked about the president's mood after returning from Washington, did not hesitate and said that the head of state was disappointed. In the second year of the war, Zelensky's characteristic optimism, sense of humor, and ability to enliven meetings are currently unnoticeable. As one of his associates says, now he comes in, receives information, gives orders, and leaves. Another source claims that Zelensky feels betrayed by Western allies who have left him without the resources needed to win the war, offering only support for its survival. Despite failures on the front line, President Zelensky does not intend to give up fighting, and his faith in Ukraine's ultimate victory has strengthened to such an extent that some of his advisors are beginning to worry about it. This faith is unshaken and borders on messianism, notes the newspaper. However, one of Zelensky's closest advisors states with frustration that he is deceiving himself. "We no longer have a choice. We're not winning," but try telling him that. The determination of Zelensky hampers the development of a new strategy and message, claim some sources quoted by the newspaper. When talking about the future of conflict, the topic of negotiating a peace agreement with Russia is taboo. Even a temporary ceasefire stands in opposition to President's position, emphasizes Time. In view of potential reduction in military support from allies, Ukraine invests in drone production and missiles, using them for attacks on Russian supply routes, command points, and ammunition depots. Zelensky sees these situations as a war of wills. The leader warns that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, conflict may spread beyond its borders. It has been said for a long time Third World War may start in Ukraine, be continued in Israel, then in Asia, and then break out elsewhere, he stated. The head of state believes that stopping war equals its defeat. In these days, during his foreign visits and discussions with leaders of Western countries, Zelensky must convince his interlocutors that supporting Ukraine serves national interests of those allied countries. As Time points out, this is becoming more demanding as more crises arise worldwide. In this context, President Joe Biden emphasized that such help will bring dividends. The address to the nation delivered by President Joe Biden has become a hot topic of discussion in the media, which revolves around the controversial question of whether the West will abandon Ukraine. This is also the title of an article published last month, Foreign Affairs, titled "Will the West Abandon Ukraine?", in which authors Liana Fix and Michael Kimmich analyze opinions that have recently appeared in public debates in the West and the moods in societies and the will of decision-makers of these countries. This is certainly a phenomenon particularly noticeable in the United States, where the issue of aid to Ukraine arouses many emotions. According to research data for American television in August of this year, as many as 55% of respondents believed that the United States Congress should not approve additional financial support for Ukraine. Additionally, 51% of those surveyed believe that the United States has already done enough to help Ukrainians, while 48% believe that the US should get even more involved in aid. It is worth noting that we observe a decrease in support compared to 62% support for aid from the United States to Ukraine at the beginning of the Russian invasion. Republicans, mainly from former President Donald Trump's camp, are exploiting the isolationist mood in American society. They are trying to block any budget plans containing additional financial aid for Kyiv. Currently, President Biden is seeking to pass an aid package for US allies worth $16 billion. Of this amount, $61 billion is earmarked for Ukraine and $14 billion for Israel. This is a clever move by Democrats who combine aid for both countries to put pressure on Republicans and push through this package. However, its future is uncertain as the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Republican Mike Johnson, is trying to have aid for these countries voted on separately. The coming days and weeks will show whether Democrats will be able to implement this aid despite resistance from Republicans. All this indicates an existing problem of lack of certainty about long-term support for Ukraine, which poses a major challenge as noted earlier. The authors of the article emphasize that although openly pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian voices are still rare, there are more and more skeptics about lasting aid for Kyiv. This trend can be seen not only in the United States but also in Europe. The old continent is still struggling with the consequences of the COVID pandemic and is grappling with high inflation caused by war, which affects a decrease in optimism in terms of supporting an ongoing conflict lasting over 600 days. At the root of this skepticism lies the ongoing Ukrainian counter-offensive. Currently, it does not go as smoothly as one might expect in light of Western decision-makers' expectations and mainstream media forecasts from the turn of last year and this year. The Russians have fortified their positions and left behind numerous mines, leading to slow progress and modest recovery of lost territories by Kyiv. However, authors point out another equally important issue. Even if the counteroffensive suddenly gained momentum, it would not mean a quick end to conflict. Lack of a specified victory strategy becomes a significant obstacle in potentially ending this conflict. It is not clear what specific goal would have to be achieved by Ukrainian nation to be able to speak about full victory. Would it be enough to regain control over areas occupied by Russia since February 24th last year? Or is it also necessary to regain annexed Crimea in 2014? Maybe victory could simply be recognized if Russia was significantly weakened on military strategic level. The main challenge for Ukraine seems not so much sudden change in political landscape in West, but slow withdrawal of foreign aid network, which seems like an accurate observation. It has been noted that if such a change were to occur anywhere, the most likely place would be the United States, especially in the context of the potential re-election of Donald Trump in November next year. Indeed, Trump publicly promised to end the war within 24 hours of winning the election, suggesting that this could be done through a phone call with Putin and Zelensky. However, it is worth considering the reality of such a promise, and to what extent it may be an element of an election campaign. The deep political engagement of the United States in this conflict means that Ukraine's defeat would be unacceptable. This would mean a loss of prestige on the international stage and sending a negative signal to other allies, including Taiwan. However, there is a possibility that Trump could consider certain forms of compromise and try to present them as a victory for Kyiv. An equally realistic scenario is that the United States will continue to support Ukraine, but perhaps to a lesser extent than before. In fact, currently, it is not the conflict in Ukraine that attracts the most global attention, but the ongoing clashes between Israel and Hamas, which have huge potential for escalation throughout the Middle East. As a result, Kyiv may encounter greater difficulties in attracting attention and support for its cause. Moreover, there is concern that previous aid for Ukraine may be reduced in favor of funds and equipment that are being directed to Israel. This is evidenced by, for example, the Pentagon's decision to approve the delivery of 10,000 artillery shells for Israel, which were originally intended for Ukraine. As shown by pro-Palestinian protests taking place in many countries around the world, Warsaw is currently in a state of mobilization since the start of the Israeli offensive in the Gaza Strip. The situation is so serious that the United States has sent 2 aircraft carriers to the region along with strike groups, USS Gerald Ford and USS Dwight Eisenhower. The presence of these ships acts as a deterrent and may influence Hezbollah's decision, supported by Iran, on a potential massive attack on Israel from its northern border with Lebanon. Statements by President Biden clearly indicate that Israel has full support from the United States, both politically and militarily, in its fight against Hamas, which includes arms supplies and deterring potential rivals in the region. At the same time, the American president clearly stated that he has no intention of abandoning Kyiv, which he clearly emphasized in his address. He combined both issues of support for Israel and Ukraine in it, comparing Hamas's actions to those of Russia under Putin's leadership. We will have to observe how developments in the Middle East will affect Biden's promise fulfillment, and whether in case of his rival's re-election, USA will continue to support Ukraine as firmly as before. It is in Kyiv's interest for Western countries to include financial aid and guarantees for Ukraine in their laws and long-term budgets, which could protect against sudden withdrawal of support in case of government change. Nevertheless, Ukraine must adapt to new realities and be prepared for Western attention to be divided between both conflicts. According to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, conflict in Gaza should not negatively affect support for Ukraine. It is necessary to be prepared for potential new Russian attacks directed against energy supplies and critical infrastructure. Currently, there are no signs that Russia is seeking to make peace. On the contrary, it seems that they are planning a more offensive way of conducting military operations. Therefore, it is necessary to continue supporting Ukraine, which involves delivering even more weapons, Stoltenberg emphasized. According to NATO Secretary General, Russian President Vladimir Putin could make a decision to end the war today by stopping attacks on Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine does not have such an opportunity. If it ceases to defend itself, it will be under occupation, and this will not bring peace, he emphasized. Stoltenberg believes that Western support for Ukraine also contributes to the security of Europe, and the determination of Ukrainians in the fight is a great victory. He pointed out that Russia has suffered a defeat. It has lost tens of thousands of soldiers and large amounts of military equipment. Additionally, it has lost political influence and is becoming increasingly isolated. The NATO Secretary General added that all member countries of the alliance agree that Ukraine should become a member of NATO. According to Stoltenberg, it is important that the conflict in the Middle East does not turn into a serious regional conflict. There is also concern that Iran, Hezbollah, and other groups may try to exploit the current situation to escalate violence. The Secretary General emphasized that NATO countries advocate for the establishment of humanitarian corridors and a cessation of hostilities in order to protect civilians. Military operations must be carried out in accordance with international law, and terrorist attacks on Israel are condemned. At the same time, it is expected that Israel's response will take into account the protection of civilian lives. Ukraine, in addition to achieving victory, also has other goals. President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that one of the main political priorities for Ukraine at the end of this year is preparing to start negotiations on membership in the European Union. In his evening address to the nation, the president spoke about the situation on the front in eastern and southern Ukraine and presented his expectations towards EU institutions. He also said that a preparatory meeting on cooperation with the European Union took place, emphasizing the importance of this step for the political future of the country. President Zelensky stressed that all levels of government must be ready for this, and they are. Additionally, he expressed expectations about the readiness of European institutions. In terms of military operations in Ukraine, the president noted that in today's rapidly changing world, successes often become the norm. He expressed pride in the fact that at the beginning of aggression, many expected that Ukraine would not survive. Now, however, achievements of nation and its soldiers are treated as an obvious thing. President Zelensky stressed that Ukraine's success in battle in Black Sea will be remembered in history, even though it is rarely talked about now. Additionally, he emphasized that regardless of everything, it is necessary to make every effort in defense of state Ukrainian independence, our life culture as well as freedom, and declared that they will do so. Let me know in comment what you think about Zelensky's words. Whether indeed, if Ukraine loses war, we can expect further conflicts, and consequently war which will spill over the whole world. If you appreciate my work and you liked material, please leave thumbs up. See you in next material.